In this section, the final section of the unit, we will discuss public policy in Texas. So let's start with some definitions of public policy. Public policy is any action or inaction by the government that impacts the lives of its citizens. So action or inaction by the government, it's a public policy. So action policies could be anything. Changing the speed limit in an area that has had wrecks, that's an action policy. That's an action that the government has taken to address a problem. Maybe there's an intersection in your community. There's a lot of wrecks, and so maybe the city council or the county government has decided to put up new red lights or stop signs or something to change the intersection in such a way to make it more safe. That is an action. Of course, inaction is also a policy as well. Let's say there's a problem at an intersection and some people think that there's a lot of accidents there and there should be red lights put there. The city council meets, they decided they don't have the money to do it, and they say we will not be putting any red lights. That is a public policy. It's an inaction. They've chosen not to do something to address a problem, so therefore that's a policy. That is their policy, is that we're not going to do anything. So public policy can be an action or an inaction. Traditionalistic political culture, which is the political culture of Texas. If you remember, it goes back to we've always kind of done things this way, so we shouldn't change them. So that's a traditionalistic political culture, and the traditionalistic political culture of Texas lends itself to very little innovation and much inaction. Basically, they have to be pulled kicking and screaming in the state of Texas to make laws that do much of anything. So there's very little innovation, meaning newness to the laws in Texas, and there's a lot of inaction. Now, Texas, compared to other states, something called the Policy Liberalism Index shows that, spells out and just basically proves that Texas is a traditionalistic, a state that lacks innovation and is very inactive compared to other states, much more inactive and conservative than liberal as far as making policies. Okay, let's talk about the steps in the policy-making process. While they may vary, and some books or places may add additional intermittent stages or steps, for the most part, these are the 5 steps in most all policy-making processes, be it national, state, or local government. Number 1, you should know these, and you should know the order and understand what each means. First, problem recognition, recognizing what the problem is. You don't need to even talk about a policy unless there's some problem that's come up. If everything's hunky-dory and everything is going just great, then there's not a problem. Therefore, we don't need to make any laws. So problem recognition is the first step. Somebody sees a problem, and that could be a citizen, and they tell the city council. It could be a member of the city council. It could be any person could initiate the policy-making process by recognizing a problem. Once the problem is recognized, the next step is agenda setting. That means it has to get on the agenda of those that can actually do something about it. So if I recognize a problem in my community, I'm step 1. If I go to the city council and say, I want you to do something about this problem, and they discuss it, it is agenda setting. They have put it on the agenda. They're going to look at the problem and discuss the problem and decide what they're going to do about it. And that leads to the next step, number 3, policy formulation. This is the creation of public policy. And it's at this point when I went to, in step 1, when I recognized the problem, step 2, I told them about it. Now step 3, they're either going to do an action or an inaction. And this is the formulation of the policy. And the formulation of the policy could be done by anybody. Of course, most of the time it's either members of the city council themselves or special interest groups that have a special knowledge of the problem that I've recognized. But in some form or format, they're going to work out a formulation. They're going to work out a solution, either by doing nothing or doing something. And once they determine this policy, they formulate this policy, they will vote on it and hopefully pass it. Now, once it's passed and the city council has created this policy to fix the problem that was recognized, then they must implement the policy. That means put it into effect. It's one thing to say, okay, they're having crime in this, more crime in this one part of town. We're going to create a policy to do it, to fix it. Have more police. Our policy is to, have more police driving through the community or whatever. Well, once you do that, you've created the policy. Then you have to implement it. Then you have to schedule the police going to that part of the community in order to, decrease the drug sales or whatever. So implementing the policy, and that can be a problem because, city government and state government, local government, they're, sometimes get set in their ways, and a new law may change the way they do things. And so there can be resistance to that. So they're going to implement the policy and actually see how it works. And hopefully they're going to, hopefully it works. The whole point is for the policy to work. But after at least probably a year, sometimes longer, after the policy's been in effect, then they're going to do something. The final step of the policy-making process is policy evaluation. You're going to evaluate it. You're going to look at it and you're going to say, okay, this was our problem. This was our policy we put in place to fix the problem. Did it fix the problem? Did it make the problem go away? Did it improve it a little bit? Did it make the problem worse? And so you're going to evaluate it in an honest way and decide whether the policy worked or not. And then at that point, you're going to go back to step one. If the policy did not work, then you recognize what the new problems are and you start the process over. If the policy did work, then you can just continue with the policy and reevaluate it later on. So 5 steps to the policy-making process you need to know. 1, problem recognition. 2, agenda setting. 3, policy formulation. 4, policy implementation. 5, policy evaluation. Now let's take a look at tuition and fees in higher education. In the 1970s, when the state legislature basically funded most all of the universities through, general revenue from our taxes, tuition was very low. It was a high priority to have low tuition to allow students to go to school. And so in the 70s, tuition was something like $4 per semester hour, which means that you could take a class, a 3-hour credit class, for $12. 1980s and the 1990s, the legislature began to allow the universities to charge higher tuition, but it was strictly regulated, and the tuition levels were strictly dictated to the universities by the legislature. Now, the larger universities specifically, especially UT, University of Texas, and Texas A&M, had been pushing for deregulation of tuition so they could raise more revenue. They knew that most people in the state of Texas, they had more applicants than any other university, the University of Texas and Texas A&M. So the demand for their classes and a spot in their university was much higher than for other colleges, and they knew based on supply and demand that they could charge more for their services and their classes. So they started arguing for deregulation. And of course, the state of Texas, the legislature would be like, well, sure, we don't mind deregulating because that means there's less money that we would have to spend in tax dollars on higher education. So in 2003, a new policy of deregulation of tuition for all state universities. Now, prior to this implementation of this deregulation policy, the tuition average per semester was almost $1,700 per semester. Okay, so you could take a semester of classes or a full year of classes for, about a little less than $3,500. In But after deregulation, 10 years later, by 2012, the tuition average per semester was $8,500. So you're looking at $17,000 per year, as opposed to about $3,500 per year. And this all goes back to the shifting of the cost of the education and the question of whether higher education is a collective benefit which costs should be shared by the entire community, which means tax dollars paying for everybody's higher education and allowing students that are qualified and capable to go at a low expense, or to make it deregulated and not pay for the school tuition or keeping tuition low by paying in taxes and shifting the burden to the actual students who go to the school, regardless of their economic situation. Of course, nowadays we have Pell Grants and student loans, but Pell Grants are fine if you're going to a community college because they will cover basically the cost of the entire community college. But if you go to a university, Pell Grant awards don't go up. Okay, so it's the same amount of money trying to pay for a more expensive school. And so most students will end up having to take out loans and come out with a very high debt burden, or their parents will have to dig into their savings and their retirement to pay for your education. So it's just a priority situation. Do we prioritize higher education as a collective good, a public good, or do we just say, you're all on your own and you're just going to have to find the money to go? It's an important question. Other higher education issues, curriculum and degree requirements. The legislature and the accrediting agencies. Accrediting agencies are these governing bodies that oversee universities and colleges to determine that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing or teaching what they're supposed to be teaching. And so in order to make sure that you fall under the accrediting agency's rules and means you are an accredited school, you have to follow certain curriculum and degree requirements, provide certain things across all colleges. In the state of Texas, bachelor's degrees, require things like you have to have 2 English compositions, you have to have a literature, you have to have 2 government classes, 2 history classes, and a math class, and on and on and on. So these things are dictated by accrediting agencies, and oftentimes too, some of it by state legislature. Now, how are these universities funded besides tuition by the student? Well, the money has to come from somewhere because regardless of what I talked about in the previous tile, the state still pays for much of, or a lot, not much of it, but a lot of the funding for universities. And it's basically broken down into 2 separate funds, the Permanent University Fund and the Higher Education Assistance Fund. The Permanent University Fund was created very, very long ago, in Texas history, to fund basically the 2 main universities in the state of Texas, the University of Texas and Texas A&M. And a lot of it's based on oil revenue and things like that from oil extracted from the ground. But so these universities have always gotten this money from the Permanent University Fund. Well, other universities in the state of Texas were not so lucky. So you look at your Lamars and your Sam Houstons and your SFAs, and they were not part of this Permanent University Fund. So all these other universities got together and they argued to the legislature, we deserve funding too. It's not fair that A&M and UT get this money and we don't. So a new fund was set up called the Higher Education Assistance Fund that funds all the other state universities except Texas A&M and the University of Texas. Now, access to higher education, there's a wide variety of universities that offer access to many different people. You have some like community colleges that are open enrollment that basically, if you have a GED, you can go to school. You have a GED or high school education, you can take college classes. Now you may have to take remedial classes, but based on your level. But if you pass the remedial classes and bring your skill level up to college level, you can take college classes. And then of course there are others that have very strict higher standards as to who can get in, and a lot of it's based on supply and demand. If you have if you have a college that is very prestigious and a lot of students want to get into it, and especially the smartest ones, well, you can raise your standards for admission. Uh, now, early in the middle of the 20th century, of course, the Civil Rights Movement, one of the big arguments on the Civil Rights Movement during the Civil Rights Movement was access to higher education for minority groups. Because many, just like in the public schools and things like Brown versus Board of Education ruling, um, many state universities, public universities across the South especially, refused admission to black students or Hispanic students. So even after laws were passed, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there were still ways in which many of these universities use loopholes to limit the number of minority students getting into college. And so affirmative action policies were put into place to increase minority enrollment. And some of these were quotas, what we call quotas, which are basically a percentage of student admission set aside for certain groups. So 10% of the new incoming freshman class will be, you know, uh, black or Hispanic or whatever. Uh, and so these policies were put into place. And of course, they were challenged under the arguments of things like reverse discrimination. But one of those challenges actually reached the Supreme Court, and it was called the Hopwood decision. And the Hopwood decision in 1996 in the state of Texas ended affirmative action in enrollment. Of course, that decision was later challenged in Grutter versus Bollinger in 2003, where the Supreme Court ruled that while, because affirmative action is saying, okay, this many seats are set aside for a minority group, which means you're taking race as a factor into the admission process. In Grutter versus Bollinger, they kind of found a middle ground that said you could use race as a factor in admissions, but you can't use quotas. You can use race as a factor in admission, but you can't use quotas, meaning a specific number of this group. So you could say to yourself, okay, I have a black applicant and a white applicant, and they're basically equal. Everything about what they've got is equal. But we really need to diversify our school. We think we have too many, white students compared to, it doesn't represent the general population, the ratio of students. So we're going to choose the black student. That's okay. That Greta versus Bollinger said. You can use race as a factor in admissions, but you can't use hard quotas. One way in which they've been able to get more minority enrollment in universities is the 10% rule. And basically that's the rule that says, and many of you may know this, that if you're a dual credit student especially, if you're in the top 10% of your class, your graduating class, then you are guaranteed admission into basically any state university in Texas. And so if you have a predominantly African American, high school, then it's very likely that the top 10% of that African American high school who finish in that class will all go on to UT or A&M or any state university of their choice. So anyway, that's a way to help diversify the enrollment of Texas universities. Other public policy issues that we're dealing with today, voter ID, this idea that voters should be required to present a valid picture ID before they can vote. Now, when I say valid, the legislature is arguing that it should be a very specific form, one that's issued by the state. So therefore, it cannot be a college ID. It cannot be anything except something that's issued by the state. Many people, and the argument for this law is to prevent voter fraud. The only problem is there's not any voter fraud. There's been very few, if any, minimal examples of voter fraud where somebody tries to go vote in somebody else's place. I would argue it's hard enough to get people to go vote in the first place than for people to actually go try to vote more in somebody else's place. Uh, these are supported by Republicans and opposed by Democrats for the most part, and it goes back to the kind of the conservative liberal argument. The population is growing, and it's usually the growth in the population right now in the state of Texas and in the nation is young people and non-white people. And so oftentimes these people tend to vote Democratic. And so some argue that these policies are being supported by Republicans simply to make it more difficult for a certain segment of the population, ones that aren't Republican and aren't likely to vote Republican. It's an attempt to make it more difficult for them to vote. And so it's become a very controversial topic. So voters in Texas are now required to show picture ID, but I think just yesterday or today, and well, of course, whoever's listening to this, you don't know the date, but just recently, a Texas voter ID law was declared unconstitutional by the federal circuit courts. So that's it's kind of up in the air right now. Um, those supporting the law, and we'll just summarize again, claim the law will reduce voter fraud and improve integrity of the electoral system. Those that oppose it say that there's no real evidence of voter fraud, claim that the law will disenfranchise elderly, minority, and low-income citizens who are more likely to vote Democratic and who have less money to go out and get the kind of IDs that are required to vote. And they also see this as an extension of the historical voter suppression in the South that goes back to the literacy tests and the grandfather clauses and the poll taxes. Another issue that has been in the news and very popular is the issue of gay rights. Controversy over what rights gay persons should have, and how the government should enforce or implement those. A lot of it boils down to, and most controversial of them, is the position on same-sex marriage. Now, the position on same-sex issues statistically is impacted by generation and age. And what that means is basically young people, it's not a big deal to them. They don't see a problem with gay people being accepted and gay people getting married statistically. But older generations that that grew up in a different time period, they have a problem with it. In 2005, voters passed an amendment to the Texas Constitution that banned same-sex marriage, that basically defined it as marriage is only between a man and a woman. But other states have made gay marriage legal. And of course, the U.S. Constitution's full faith and credit clause basically says this: any legal ruling or document from one state is legal and binding in another state. So any licensing, like driver's license, if you get a driver's license in Texas and you want to travel across the country, you don't have to get a new driver's license for every state you pass through. Those states give full faith and credit to your Texas driver's license. Same thing with marriage license. If my wife and I got married in Texas, if we wish to move to Nevada or to Florida or wherever, when we move there, we don't have to get remarried with a Florida marriage license. They give full faith and credit to the Texas marriage license. Well, that raises the question: what happens when a gay couple in Vermont who got married in Vermont moves to Texas? Okay, because Vermont has legalized gay marriage. And according to full faith and credit, Texas has to accept and respect their marriage license. Of course, this was one of the problems, legal problems with banning same-sex marriage. So just recently, that says today on there, but by the time you read it, these things change so quickly. As of the making of this PowerPoint presentation, 19 states had legal same-sex marriage, 31 states have outlawed same-sex marriage. But just very recently, just a few days before I'm reading this, a few weeks before I'm reading this, the U.S. Supreme Court has basically declared laws that ban same-sex marriage unconstitutional, meaning now all states must allow gay people to get married if they wish. Other controversial issues, abortion rights, that's always been controversial and will always be controversial. Uh, the right to an abortion, but the Supreme Court decision offering, giving women the right to access to abortions. It goes back, it's a very complex and convoluted issue within the court because basically it started out as a right to privacy issue. A right to privacy issue going back to 1965. In 1965, the state of Connecticut had laws that made it illegal for people to buy contraception, okay, to get to sell it or buy it. I'm talking about, either IUDs or birth control pills or condoms or whatever. It was illegal to buy or sell those. The Griswolds, and this is the case of Griswold versus Connecticut, the Griswolds were a married couple who were married, they didn't have any children, but they didn't want children at that moment. And they wanted to, continue on being married and have children later in life. But they also, as a married couple would want to do, they wanted to have sexual relations. And this law, they argued, making it illegal for them to get contraceptions, is basically forcing them to have children against their will. It's telling them that, okay, if you have sex, you're going to have children, when, if they had access to contraception, they could have sex and not have children. And they said this is a violation of our right to basic privacy and our right to our own reproductive decisions. Basically, they're arguing, the Griswolds are, that Connecticut is determining our personal reproduction. The government is telling us when we can have children. And they argue that that's an overstep of the, infringes on their right to privacy. And the Supreme Court agreed with them and declared unconstitutional those Connecticut laws. Well, take the next step. In the early 1970s, a woman named Jane Roe, well, that's the name they gave her, but she has since then come out with a real name and everything. But she got pregnant she didn't, well, no, she had an unplanned pregnancy and she wanted to get an abortion in the state of Texas. And in the early 70s, Texas had very, very, very strict abortion laws, making it very difficult to get an abortion. And so she sued, basically using Griswold versus Connecticut, saying, I have this unplanned, unwanted pregnancy. The laws of the state are forcing me to have the child. Therefore, they're determining my reproduction, and that is a violation of my personal right to determine my own reproduction, my right to privacy. And the Supreme Court agreed with them again, and overturned Texas's strict laws regarding abortions, and made abortion much more accessible to women. But throughout the country, since that time, states have passed laws that chip away at these at access to abortion, either by things like parental or spousal informing your parents or your spouses that you're going to have an abortion, or limiting the gestation weeks of the pregnancy and when you can actually get an abortion. And the Texas legislature is no different. It has recently passed bills limiting the ability of women to access abortion with that parental or father or spousal consent, requiring sonograms of all women who wish to get an abortion, and increase funding for pro-life counseling and reduce funding for pro-choice counselors. So this is an ongoing argument, and the two sides are very adamant. Both sides are adamant in their in what they expect. Sex education, we touched on this a little bit earlier in the semester. The conflicting attitudes about the role of public schools, on whether the schools should be a tool for informing children about the facts of sex and sex education, or should the schools leave it up to the parents who, while sometimes maybe giving their children good information, may also either not be talking to their children at all about sex, or giving them false, wrong, or otherwise incorrect information. It's a real problem. And as always, in conclusion, All information in this presentation, as well as all information in the chapter, may appear on the exams.